Yeah. You mentioned forgiveness again, and I want to unpack that a little more for a minute. I think forgiveness sometimes in some Christian circles it get a pretty narrow idea, and oh, it's just you're supposed to let it go and say it was okay. Um, One of the things I see when there's some really bad stuff, heavy stuff to be dealt with, it's not okay. That's why forgiveness is the only way to deal with it. Forgiveness isn't minimizing it. Um, what did that process look like for you? You've alluded to it, but let's talk about that a bit more. What kind of a father did you have? How did that affect you? I'm Dr. Carol. Thank you for joining us. Coming up to Father's Day, the topic of father gets a little more attention than it does at other times during the year. And if you're watching this when it first comes out, we are just within days of Father's Day this year. Some fathers, God bless them, are wonderful. Other fathers, not so much. And your experience of father absolutely impacts your life, maybe in ways that you don't even really understand. That's the father effect. My guest on the program today is John Finch. His story of being wounded in the area of being fathered, and in his case, not fathered, I'll let him tell you his story, impacted him in ways he didn't fully understand for many years. And then God got a hold of him. I don't want to wait any longer. Just let's get right into our conversation with John Finch. Well, John Finch, thank you so much for being part of our program today. Just welcome. And we're talking about fathers. Glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to talk with you, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah. Fathers, we're coming up to Father's Day. If you're watching or listening to this when it first comes out, we're just days away from Father's Day. And this has been a big deal, both in your own personal life and in your ministry and in writing. And John, I'd like to just start by having you share a bit of your story and what fatherhood looked like for you, how that paradigm became such a big deal for you. And it was pretty tough.
It was. So when I was 11 years old, my dad committed suicide. And so for about 30 years, literally, I just kind of wandered through this world, really a lost young man. Didn't have anybody there walking alongside me, showing me and telling me what a real godly man looked like. So I bought into everything that the world says you need to be. It's all about success, money, power, a lot of what many men buy into, right? And because I didn't have that dad showing me or telling me different, I was picking up things from TV, from movies, from other friends' dads, most of it negative in many ways. And so for 30 years, I was a very angry guy. Now, you wouldn't have been able to tell it looking at me. I'm pretty jovial and pretty, optimistic guy and love to laugh and have fun. But inside, I was like just this volcano. And that anger I had toward my dad and God. I was angry at my dad for committing suicide. So he left me, he abandoned me, he betrayed me, right? Yeah. So there was this wound of abandonment and betrayal. And in my mind as a young man, I was mad at God for allowing him to do so, right? Mm-hmm. So I struggled and I was just a very angry guy, and I medicated all of that with alcohol. Starting about probably 11th grade in high school, started drinking. And then as I got into college, it got much worse. And even as a single man was much worse. And it was about 12 years ago that God just took me to this place of brokenness. Wow. And it was a place he had to take me to get my attention because I was having too much fun running from it. Yeah. And I'd had this conversation with a friend of mine a couple of years previous to this day. And we were just talking about some of my own struggles, and he was a believer. And he said at one point, he said, "You grew up without a father, didn't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And I went on to give him this amazing 10-minute explanation about how incredible my mom is. And she's just an angel on this earth, right? And when I finished, he turned to me, he said, "But was she a dad?"
Yeah.
And that was like the
Yeah.
first time I think I'd ever thought about that, right?
Wow.
And
Wow.
so I remember walking away from the golf course and like thinking, okay, I'm not some abnormal, weird, just totally jacked up guy. There's this thing and it makes sense to me, this
Mm.
wound, and it's what I have. And I need to try to figure this thing out. Now, that being said, I was still prideful for a couple of years because I thought, well, I'll man up, suck it up, figure it out on
Yeah.
my own, right?
Yeah.
Uh, but that led up to the day of God taking me to this place of brokenness. My family was, I wasn't the father I needed to be. I wasn't the husband, I wasn't the man that I needed to be to lead my family well. And so in this moment, God just showed it very clear to me. You've got this father wound, and it is impacting every aspect of your life in ways that you don't even know.
Yes.
And so when I finally just totally surrendered and I
Mm.
said, okay, Lord, I'm in. I got to figure this thing out. I'm fixing to lose my family, my wife, the whole
Wow.
bit. I started going and seeing a Christian counselor, and that journey began. And it was about a 3 or 4 month journey where I was going to see this counselor every week, and um, God was showing something to me and revealing something to me every single time, every session, every time I walked out the door. I'd be like, wow, there was this revelation of God just really purifying me through this process, right? Through me being able to talk about some of the issues I had. I couldn't even say the word dad
Wow.
without weeping
Mm.
because of what that meant to me in my life as an
Right.
earthly father and
Right.
the abandonment and betrayal. So it was in one of those sessions that it's funny. It's kind of like one of those cartoon shows where you see, or movies where the guy's listening to the other person, but he's not paying attention. He's totally somewhere else and zoned out.
Yep.
And I'm listening to I'm watching the counselor, and I just heard this, not audible, but within my spirit. How can you be so bitter, resentful, and angry towards a man who didn't know how to be a father? You
Wow.
see, for me, it was as I started the journey, I learned things about my dad that I had no idea. I heard stories about my father, and I came to understand that he grew up an incredible rough life. I mean, he had five different fathers. His mom was married five different times, had no stable
Wow.
role model for a father. I mean, was dropped off in the middle of New Orleans at the age of 16 to live on his own. His mom just said, hey, have a good life. I'll see you.
Mm.
She took off with a truck driver. So there was all these things that I had begun to learn and have these conversations with my mom about. And here's what it came down to. The pivotal piece of what God was showing me
Yeah.
was simply this. My dad could not give what he did not have. And it was in that God began to open my eyes to the forgiveness. And ultimately, he showed me forgiveness for my father. And it radically changed my life as a man, husband, and father.
Yeah. Wow, John. As you tell that story, I hear several things. Your grandfather did not, wasn't able to be a father to your father. And I'm sure if we delve deeper, there's probably more stories there. So your father came with father wounds to being your father, and then you passed that on. You mentioned you were not being the husband and father that you wanted to be and needed to be yours. So this father, or lack thereof, fatherhood effect that's not happening just gets passed down generation to generation. You described that in your own life in just a couple minutes. What do you see in the church, in the world, all of it around? Your story isn't unique.
No, it's not. It's interesting. As we began to make the movie, everybody I talked to had a story,
Yeah.
and most were not good, at least at the beginning. A lot of them were good in the end because they found forgiveness of their father, and it was very similar to mine. It just radically changed their life. And so, I think most men, especially, there's a lot of men that are angry and they
Yes.
don't even know why, right?
Oh, John,
And that was
I just
me.
got to interrupt. We are hearing and seeing stuff in culture recently about angry young men acting out violently. I mean, wow, we're seeing that just in recent days.
And you know what? That stems, that anger, and we can unpack it. There's a lot of different things there, right?
Right.
Which I
Right.
know you're familiar with, but it's a young man not having the affirmation, not knowing a dad loves him, not knowing he's the apple of his dad's eye,
Yeah.
right? Not knowing those things makes a young man mad, because then he questions who he is. If he is he even a man? What is that?
Yeah.
What is the definition of that? If he doesn't have somebody walking alongside him, telling him, showing him that, he's very confused and lost. And again, most of these young men will then buy into everything this world's telling them, which is a lie and a myth in so many ways.
Yeah. The OBGYN part of me, keeping up on women and women's health and so on. And I just got to make this comment. You probably know this too, John, that young women who have a deeply involved, loving, attached relationship with their father, much less likely to engage in things such as risky sexual behavior early. They tend to get married a little later in a more healthy way and more stable relationships themselves. It's you've talked about the effect on young men. It is young women too.
Absolutely. I have 3 daughters. So this is very close to my heart, right?
Wow.
In the way that I do my best to father and love my girls,
Yeah.
and help them know that they are loved, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the interesting stories that we had with Dr. Meg Meeker, who wrote Strong Fathers, Strong Daughters, which I recommend to every dad that has a daughter. She told this great story. She said, John, I'm a pediatrician by trade. She said, I've had thousands of young ladies come into my office. She said, I started seeing this trend where it was younger and younger and younger as they were having sex.
Mm-hmm.
It was 16, then 15, then 14, then 13. And she said, on more than one occasion, I'd have a 13, 14-year-old girl come in my office. I would check her out. Everything was fine. And before she would leave, she would say, hey, Dr. Meeker, can you write me a prescription? Yeah. And she'd say, you're totally fine. There's nothing wrong with you. She said, I don't care what the prescription's for. Just put at the bottom of it, cannot have sex. Wow. She said, John, what was happening is these young ladies were having sex with Billy. It wasn't physically or emotionally pleasurable, but it was the only positive, fatherly, manly touch they were getting. Yes. And so the prescription was their permission slip to go tell Billy, hey, Billy, I can't have sex anymore.
Wow. That breaks my heart. You mentioned your daughters, and earlier that you weren't being the husband and father that you wanted to be until God got a hold of you and you did some of your own heart work around your own father wound. How were you, perhaps getting a little vulnerable here, how were you not being the father you wanted to be? What did that look like?
I was not as engaged as I needed to be, wasn't walking in an awareness like that I do now, right? In the tone that I use, the body language that I use, the things that I say to my daughters, and the things that I say to my wife, and the way I love my wife in front of my daughters, right? Because modeling is a big piece. That was one of the big wow moments for me in this whole process. It's understanding that as a man, husband, and father, I'm setting the standard by which my daughters are going to measure every other man, husband, and father. Yeah. And in many cases, I'm setting the standard by which they're going to marry a man. So I want to set that standard as high as possible, right? But it was the little things in that now what I do, and I try to be intentional and purposeful every morning, and even during the day, I try to hug and love my wife in front of my girls. Because I want them, the last thing they need to worry about with all the other stuff going on in this world is to walk out that door and think there's something going on with mom and dad and they don't love each other, right? So to reaffirm those type of things, and not only that, one of the most intimate moments and such a great bonding moment is when I'm able to pray together with my family, and I pray for my wife out loud in front of my girls about her servant's heart. What a blessing she is to have as a mom and a wife, and just speaking life in her to the Father in front of my girls. It doesn't get much better than that.
Wow. Wow. I want to ask you about that because there's not infrequently a man who will say something to me when I talk about a couple praying together or family praying together and the man leading prayer. It's like a significant number of men will shy away from that. That's too vulnerable. I can't pray. My wife is more spiritual. She's got the words. I don't have the words. What would you say to a man who struggles to pray in that way?
We're called to lead our family spiritually, right? We're called to lead them. And to the point of one of the powerful pieces in our movie was I asked the question, how did your earthly father influence your view of God the Father?
Yes.
And it's a very powerful piece. One young man said, pastors and other people encouraged him to just pray, Father God. And he said, I couldn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
I could not do it because of what father. I couldn't say the word father because of what that meant to me in my life as it represented my earthly father. And so we are a reflection of what our kids believe God the Father is like. We're the first conduit, as Dr. Mika would say,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're the first example of what our kids believe a father is supposed to be. And they will automatically transfer that view of you as a father onto their heavenly father. So if you're the distant or aloof father, they're going to think God's the same way. If you're the over the top military style, angry, whatever type of dad, they're going to think God's that same way. So we have to understand and know that we are representing God as a father in what they see. So part of that in our responsibilities is to pray with our families and for the praying, a lot of guys I run into, they're uncomfortable with it. It doesn't have to be an elaborate Billy Graham long kind of prayer, right? It's just, hey, God, thank you for this amazing family. Amen. It doesn't have to be this long drawn out elaborate prayer. So it's just speaking from the heart. And just as you and I are speaking here, that's all it is, a conversation we got.
Great. Awesome. And I got to go to something else you were talking about. The way you as a father are relating to your children impacts how they see God. What about the fathers who may be listening or watching and feel like that's too much? I can't do that. I've already failed. I've already messed up really badly. So it's better for my kids if I just walk away. I don't stay engaged because I've messed up too badly.
I think that's one of the biggest lies I think we believe too, right? Good. Is we failed too much. Or we've done so many things wrong. But here's what I've come to understand with my girls. And I came to understand as God was doing this work in me. I've shared many of my own struggles and issues with my girls. And I have a 16-year-old, a 20 and a 22-year-old. Wow. And sharing with them at age appropriate, when they were like, I think my youngest, when she was about 13 or so, I started sharing more of my story with her, and that suicide of my father and my struggles with depression, all of those things. And this does a couple of different things when we're able to be real and share some of our own stories with our kids, because they want to know. There's an innate curiosity. They want to know what was dad's dad like? What was his favorite ice cream growing up? Who was his best friends growing up? What was his favorite sports? All those type things. And so when we do that, we share our real struggles and issues. We show them that we're more than just dad, that we are human, right? That we make mistakes, that we mess up, all of those things. And unfortunately, I still to this day continue to mess up more than I want to admit, but it's just part of being a dad, right? But it also shows them that they can come to you when they've messed up and be open and honest with you.
Mm-hmm. And you've alluded to this, and I just want to say it and ask it explicitly. If they see you dealing with your stuff, being real, that gives them a mental template that they can deal with their stuff, whether it's with you, bring their hard things to you, or just later on in life. My dad didn't ignore it when he needed to grow and change. So maybe there's hope for me too. Just that message in their brain.
Absolutely. And not only even that, it's showing the adversity that you've overcome whatever you're dealing with, right? And in the way in which you do Are you trying to handle it on your own? Are you taking it to God? Are you praying? Are you walking through this thing, this season of life with God and your wife, right? It's
Yeah.
having that conversation with your wife and them hearing some of that,
Mm-hmm.
about your struggles, that they need to see that you are just that, and that I look at myself and I'm a jacked up, flawed, imperfect guy, just like my dad was, right? We're all imperfect. And so when they see that we're imperfect and that we all are, also it makes the forgiveness piece a little easier, right? It starts to connect the dots also on, oh, now I get why my dad's the way he is, because his
Mm-hmm.
father or mother was a certain way.
Yeah. You mentioned forgiveness again, and I want to unpack that a little more for a minute. I think forgiveness sometimes in some Christian circles it get a pretty narrow idea, and it's just you're supposed to let it go and say it was okay. Um, One of the things I see when there's some really bad stuff, heavy stuff to be dealt with, it's not okay. That's why forgiveness is the only way to deal with it. Forgiveness isn't minimizing it. Um, what did that process look like for you? You've alluded to it, but let's talk about that a bit more.
So, in that counselor's office that day, um, it was literally for me, and every person's journey is different, right?
Mhm.
And I've heard hundreds, if not thousands, of stories of how it's played out in other people's lives over 12 years. For me, it was like God just poured this cold bucket of water over me. And it was like, I remember walking out of the counselor's office and like literally the sky seemed bluer, the
Oh.
grass seemed greener. It was like he just removed the scales from my eyes. And it was all this 30 years. I was 41 years of age, 30 years of just hatred and bitterness and rage and all of those things that I was medicating
Mhm.
with alcohol and all the other things I was doing. It's like it was finally lifted. That burden was
Mhm.
gone.
Mhm.
Now, is that to say that there are times that, man, I really wish my dad was around, that
Sure.
I could talk to him and have conversations asking for advice? I've found other men that have kind of stepped into that gap for me.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's an important part, especially for men. But it's that forgiveness, that journey. I'll tell you what, I tell people this all the time. It was not easy. It's probably the most difficult thing I've ever done. For those
Definitely.
3 or 4 months, it was brutal. It was hard,
Yeah.
but I would do it a million times again because of what God did in me and through me and what he showed me about myself and about him.
Mhm.
The purification in the process, the healing and the heartache, right? I heard a quote one time and I love it. It said, we all want a resurrection without a crucifixion.
Yes.
And then, we've got to be willing to do the hard work to get the rewards that God is waiting to give us, but
Mhm.
we've got to be willing to go through some of that pain in order to see just how amazing we are, right? Just how strong we are, how uh, just courageous we are, and how amazing God is in the
Mhm.
result and in the journey of all that.
Yeah. Um, you talked about things God taught you about Himself as you went through this journey, and about how the way a father deals with his children changes their view of God or impacts their view of God. Let's talk to the person whose view of God has been impacted by a negative picture of their earthly father. How does that picture of God change? It's got to be more than just, oh, intellectually, I hear the preacher say God is good and God is loving. But on the inside, what's that like to walk through coming to see God as Father in the way He really is?
For me, and it's really come to play in the last few years as I've begun to understand how I father my girls,
Hmm.
right? I look and I understand the importance of grace and forgiveness, even for them, because I think, wow, imagine if I didn't give my girls grace the way God gives me grace every day,
Yeah.
right? So in fathering my girls in the best way I can, I try to understand and know how God fathers me. So the grace and the love is overwhelming at times, right? It's I had a pastor friend of mine use this analogy sometimes, where you can imagine the little kid who his dad's got his hand pressed against his head, and the little kid's just swinging. Dad's just kind of standing there, right? Because the little kid's mad. And I joked, and he was talking about that analogy. I said, yeah, I can kind of see me and God at times like that. I'm just mad.
Yep.
And he's just kind of standing there with a grin on his face. And I know many times he's sitting up there just going, oh my goodness, Finch, really? We're going to do this again? I've told you about that so many times. I've tried to help you. And that's the way we've got to understand and know how to parent our kids the same way, with the same grace and love. But from a fathering perspective, it's definitely changed my view in that, but God's become more real to me as a father through this journey and through this process, in the way that he's talked to me through various other people, through the word, the things that I just didn't see before, and I didn't focus on before, right? Because it's an awareness thing. We can just walk through this world doing our thing, focus on what we need to do next, versus like, whoa, what's God doing here in some of the little moments? So it's really the changes that my relationship has had in relation to him. And it's mostly because I finally said, okay, I've totally surrendered. I'm all in. I want to get to know you better. And that's probably been the biggest thing.
Yeah. I love you talking about how being a parent was a big part of your process of understanding how God parents us, especially as we're coming up to Father's Day. What a great analogy. And even Jesus said, if you, being fathers, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more does God want to give good gifts to you? He used that very same analogy. You being a father teaches you about God. I love that.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, the journey and the things that I've learned, the people I've been able to interview, that some of the interviews we did for the film. I mentioned a little bit this before earlier. We interviewed Neil Jeffrey, who's a pastor at Prestonwood Baptist, one of the big churches here in Dallas-Fort Worth. And he spoke, there was something in every interview I did that God was showing me about my own fathering, right? And there was a nugget. It didn't matter who I interviewed. We interviewed over 80 people. There was something I was taking back into my own home, and it was helping change my life and legacy as a dad. And his story was, he just talked about his dad being a prayer warrior, and how he was a football player for college and even NFL. And his dad would just say, huddle up, son, before the game. And even after the game, he said, I had some really tough games. My dad would say, huddle up, son, we're going to thank the Lord.
Yeah.
And he said there was nothing more powerful than to hear his father pray for him out loud by name, taking his stuff, his worries, his concerns to the Father on his behalf.
Yeah.
And so that changed my prayer life for my girls. Before that, it was, I'd walk out of the room at night, pat myself on the back, thinking I was Billy Graham. And that point on, it became, I'd ask each one of my girls, hey, what can I pray for you about? And that did a couple of things. They got to see that I was taking their concerns and worries to the Father on their behalf.
Yep.
And it got to lead to additional conversations like, okay, well, you're struggling with that worried about that test tomorrow. How can I help you? Or you got a friendship issue. How can we walk through that? So it led to additional conversation, which was always a good thing.
Awesome. Yes. Especially as kids get into the teen years or adult, you need those opportunities for conversation. You need to be alert to that. You've mentioned several times you have a movie, The Fatherhood Effect. And you've got a book, The Fatherhood Effect. Tell people a little bit about that and invite them to come check it out. Powerful way that God is using your story in helping other people understand these things.
Sure. So it's actually called The Father Effect, but it's the movie and the book. So we did the movie and we released it about 6 years ago or so. EWTN, the Global Catholic TV Network, they show it a few times a year. And then we got a book deal as a result of that. And so the movie, the 60-minute movie, is available for free on YouTube. All you got to do is go search The Father Effect. And then our book is available. We're doing a revised, updated version of our book, and it will be available on thefathereffect.com. And so the book goes into a little bit deeper detail of my story. My dad got wrapped up in the mafia, and there's a lot of things kind of behind the scenes that I don't talk about in depth at the movie.
Thefathereffect.com. We'll make sure the links to that are under this video if you're watching, or in the show notes to the podcast if you're listening. And I've checked it out. It's powerful. It's beautiful. John, thank you for sharing your story and the ministry that God has given you out of your own wounds. It's beautiful to see. And I honor and thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you, Dr. Carroll. I greatly appreciate your time and for allowing me to share my story.
Bless you. Wow. Some of you, this may have tweaked some painful aspects in your own soul that need another round of healing or growth, perhaps with your own father. Maybe this has also helped you realize how your experience with earthly parents impacted your relationship with God. And maybe that needs some help and healing and growth. Do check the links under this video. We'll have the links to John Finch's website, The Father Effect, his social media platforms, and the book, The Father Effect, Hope and Healing from a Dad's Absence. We also will have links to a couple of resources about your own experience of God as Father. A couple articles that I've written that are available on our website about how important your perception of God is, and some steps to take that if your internal experience of God is less than good, even if you know intellectually He's good, what if your heart doesn't always feel that? What are some things that you can do? So check out those links under this video. I want to thank you for being with me here today. Make sure to subscribe to this channel so you can get the notifications every time we release new content, which we do regularly, weekly. I would love to hear from you as well. You can use the contact page, check out that link, and that message is confidential if you'd like to get in touch with me. God bless you.